Morning, everyone, and welcome to the 6th panel of the day, When the Political Becomes Personal. I should apologise if you're looking at your conference brochure and you're going, where is Dame Margaret Hodge? I'm, of course, not Dame Margaret Hodge. My name is Azzurra, and I'm the UK Advocacy Officer for Reporters Without Borders. The good news is Dame Margaret Hodge is still joining us today, and she will be giving the opening remarks for today's panel. But I'm going to start by introducing our brilliant panel. We've got 6 panellists, starting with Dame Margaret Hodge, and then 2 panellists here in person, another 2 on the way, and 1 online. First, I have Chitumba. She is a journalist from Thailand and facing a huge number of legal threats herself, which she's going to talk about today. We have Gallagher with us today from Doughty Street Chambers, who, as many of you will know and needs no introduction, but represents a huge number of journalists who face awful, awful threats. We will also have here in person Dan Neidle, who is from the Tax Associates and, as you may know, faced some awful, awful legal threats earlier this year. He'll be here to talk about that today. And we also have Sarma from The Times. Joining us online, we also have Sergio, a journalist from Mexico. Can you both hear us okay?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly.
Wonderful. Well, I have the pleasure to introduce Dame Margaret Hodge, who has been a Member of Parliament for over 30 years. She is the chair of the APPG on anti-corruption and responsible tax, and she's going to give us our opening remarks for today. Dame Margaret Hodge, over to you.
Thanks very much, and I'll start with apologies because I was supposed to be there in person, but I've got an unavoidable clash between your conference and an event on the Gaza-Israel crisis, and that's really why I've got to leave. So huge apologies for that. And then the second thing I want to say is I want to really congratulate. Oh God, the light is on me. Congratulate. Sorry, we're just going to pull down a thing because otherwise you won't be able to see me and I can't see my things. Congratulate you all for the Anti-SLAPP Coalition for actually being really successful in drawing attention to an issue which is of huge, huge importance, and in the UK securing some success and progress in how we're tackling it. Can I just say to you, first of all, why it's important? It really came to me very much during the Boris Johnson era. We pride ourselves in the UK on being a strong democracy, but just succeeding in getting a big vote in an election does not protect your democracy. And there are institutions that have to be healthy, robust and strong to ensure that there is a check and balance on those that are elected. And I talked there about it, having a strong and independent judiciary, having a non-partisan civil services gets to its position on merit, having a parliament which is effective in holding the executive to account, and then most important, having freedom of expression. So we have a free and independent press and freedom of speech. And that's where the SLAPPs issue comes into its own. There has been a growing abuse of the law, particularly here in the UK, where oligarchs, politicians, just very rich, wealthy, bad people have used their wealth to employ the law to then ensure that criticism is closed down and freedom of speech is impeded, really. And it starts very often here in the UK with getting a letter from a particular a city law firm threatening you with legal action and defamation. And that quickly can become extortionately expensive if defamation law, if a defamation suit is started. And that often deters people from publication and from critical stories. The UK is a jurisdiction of choice, and I think that's partly about how our defamation law is written, but others will have talked to you about that in greater detail. I want to say 2 things before I talk about my own story very briefly. I'm very proud of the role that we have played here in the UK through an all-party parliamentary group. So it's been MPs across Parliament in securing change in legislation in relation to the use of SLAPPs in economic crime. We had an economic crime bill, which is now an act, and we used that as an opportunity to introduce for the first time anti-SLAPP provisions in legislation. They will only appertain to economic crime. We should go much further, but it is important that we've got that on the statute book, particularly because many of the SLAPPs are used by bad actors as a tool to stop disclosure around economic crime. I'm going to briefly tell you my story, because a lot of your stories are going to be about MPs who use SLAPPs to shut down criticism and debate. I have had a SLAPP used against me to close me down as an elected parliamentarian, which is a pretty shocking thing to get to. The story is that I normally use parliamentary privilege to expose bad actions and bad wrongdoings by kleptocrats and others in their role in economic crime. But I'm also a visiting professor at King's College in London. And during COVID, I decided to put together all my journey around how I'd come from starting to think about tax avoidance and how that led to me dealing with economic crime. And I wrote what was originally going to be a 10,000-word pamphlet, became a 50,000-word document, which King's was going to publish with me as the as a visiting professor there. No sooner had it been published than one of the people that I attacked that I talked about in the paper, a wealthy businessman called Mohammed Amersi, sent King's a lawyer's letter threatening defamation proceedings, and on the back of that, King's instructed me to remove the document, not distribute it, and they took it off the internet. Mohammed Amersi appeared twice in my document. He appeared firstly as an actor who had been involved. I think it was alleged in the Pandora Papers that he had been involved in supporting a Swedish telecoms company to secure a contract in Uzbekistan. And it was alleged through the Pandora Papers that he had made a lot of money out of that. That was an allegation that was covered in the UK press, and it was covered in UK television. And he then appeared later because he met the thesis I was trying to set out, that economic crime doesn't just affect the financial services, but actually infects politics and the public space. And he appeared because he gave £750,000 over time to the Conservative Party, and clearly expected something back for the money he'd given to them. And he was seeking the chairmanship of a particular Conservative Party committee and its relations in the Middle East. And he was prevented from securing that chairmanship, lost his cool, threw toys out of his pram, and talked about access capitalism. And that entirely fitted the thesis that I had, that actually dirty money was not just an evil in itself, but dirty money was infiltrating our politics. That was the basis. He said both stories were defamatory. He wanted them removed. The case went on. That I produced this paper probably about 2-3 years ago now. It was not published, and in the end, I got so fed up with the delay caused by the lengthy litigation process that I did decide, with the cooperation of a colleague from the opposition from the government benches, not in the same political party of mine, to use parliamentary privilege to get the paper out again. And a very good colleague of mine who's been very active in the anti-SLAPP movement, David Davis, a Conservative politician, read out in Parliament the two elements of my book that Mercy had taken, was questioning, and by reading them out in Parliament, gained parliamentary privilege. And I was then able to publish the document online, incorporating the reading out by David Davis of those parts that refer to Mercy.
Looks like we've lost Dame Margaret Hodge, possibly an internet connection. Just passing on our thanks, Margaret. We really appreciate you sharing that story with us, and if we have time to jump back to you, we certainly will. We welcome Dan and Pia. We're so pleased to have you on the panel today. And we're going to start a little bit by talking about some personal examples of the journalists who have faced these legal threats against politicians. Chitra, I'm going to start with you because you have a really quite horrific case against you, or two in fact. You have one that's ongoing and one that was in 2013 started by the Royal Navy in Thailand. And these cases have been so awful that it's meant you've stopped working as a journalist, which we're all really horrid and it's horrible to hear. Can you tell us a little bit about those cases and how they've impacted you?
Yeah, so I would like to share the story, the present one first. First of all, I would love to thank you for everybody to having me here. So my name is Chutimasi Dasatian, but it's such a mouthful, but you're welcome to call me Oi as a nickname. So yeah, when I fly back to Thailand next month, I possibly to be arrested, uncaused as the criminals. So why is that like that? Well, let me bring you a couple of years ago. I went back to the countryside where I growing up, and the farming families has been traumatized by debt. Government loan money mystery disappeared. 3 farmers were dead from the takeover tablets, probably suicide. I was commonly believed that the district that their debts would be die with them. But the work, it doesn't work like that, this world. So all the debt has been lived on, inherited by their children. Many children have to carry debt several million baht. And I used my reporting skill to find out what had happening. I spoke to the farmer one by one and in groups. I started to post on my personal Facebook, and then everybody can understand what happened, what's going on. Community banking has come to the district with government funds available to the farmer at low interest. But a large chunk of that money just vanishes. Now, the National Bank wants the loan money repaid, even though the many cases, the farmer never see the money. They never saw that. The bank began to sue the village one by one. My Facebook post explore how the money disappeared and inform the villager of their right as well. One local official took exception. He submitted 3 Facebook posts to the judge, have me to declare in contempt court. The judge rejected that crime. Immediately after that, that guy ran to the police station and fired me. In Thailand, policemen believe it's cause uncaused that their duty have to accept criminal defamation cases. So I become automatically a criminal. And I have to raise the bail to avoid a jail. In my experience, I was sitting behind bar 2 times. The bank conducted secret investigation. It publicly declared there has been no wrongdoing. Then turned it in attention to recovering large sum of money from specifically local officials as well as from the villager. At least one of those officials has agreed to return money he uncaused borrowed intentionally. The money just turned up into his personal bank account. I continue volunteering, advocacy, posting on my Facebook often. When something happened about the village fund, I keep posting. The official keep filing charges, and policemen also keep existing those charges as well. I facing the trial early in February for the first 3 Facebook posts. The total has been raised at the moment 7 charges, and more could be coming. The penalty a maximum 2 years jail per 1 charges. So far I got 7 already. So it could be more. These cases are pursued by the public prosecutor and by entire system of Thai justice. The person who is suing doesn't even need to hire a lawyer. They use the policeman, they use the prosecutor to helping his case, to charging me free of charge. But it's a huge cost for me. Good people in Thai legal system can see that criminal defamation law are being abused, and that these laws are in any case bad law. Civil defamation is alternative, obviously, alternative thing, but there is no momentum for changes because the deeply conservative power imbalance in Thai society. I know 10 years ago as investigation journalist, a colleague and I were sued by the criminal defamation and computer crime by the lawyer Thai Navy, facing jail up to 7 years. All the charges were dismissed. The Phuket One trial was well received international media attention. The verdict was expected, trigger change and free the Thai media. Today, I can tell you from my personal a bit experience that the situation in Thailand at the moment simply is going worse over the past decade. The number of the criminal defamation charges and slap cases in Thailand continue rise and rise and rise. It seems never ending. Innocent people and are declared quote-unquote criminal, and then they are pursued by entire might of Thai legal system. The right and wrong in the case on the missing villages, loan money are paid as the right and wrong in the human right, in the Rohingya human right trafficking that I helped to expose that about a decade ago. Thailand Nation Human Rights Commission investigation and found that I was a human rights defender and that cases as a slap case. My Facebook post has been entitling, not defamatory. Yet sadly, Thai justice remains not blindfolded, balanced, and fear, but blinded by fear. The villages has always been afraid to turn to law enforcement for help. Now it is law enforcement officials who are afraid to act or not to act, because these bad laws might be also used against them. So most of them keep silent. As the old saying reminds us, the one thing we have to fear is fear itself. I am not afraid to fight it. I will continue to fight for basic right, not just for me, but for other people who living in Thailand as well. But it's very tricky thing and very staggering, lonely, staggering as well. And I want my life back. As a 2-time quote-unquote criminal, I suggest that good people everywhere around the world should stand against criminal defamation and slap my wonderful Thailand homeland should be among the first changes, uphold the truth and the justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that story, and the idea that you could spend 14 years in prison is really alarming. So know that everyone here in this room and a huge international community is behind you, and I'm looking forward to hearing more as we go on throughout the panel today. Sergio, I'm going to turn to you next, if that's all right. You have been sued by a governor in Mexico, and you've been facing this trial since 2016. I'm sure, like Chidamanda, you have an awful sort of backstory and a history where you're struggling as well. Can you tell us also a little bit about your case?
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. I will be very brief. Yes, can you hear me well?
We can hear you perfectly.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to talk that much about my case because it's very clear. I have been litigating for the last 6 years, and it will continue for a long time, I think, which brings me personal costs. I live with bodyguards, I mean, all sorts of problems. But I want to devote the time to the situation of violence against journalists and other groups that are in danger in Mexico and all over the world. As you know, Mexico is one of the most dangerous countries in the world for journalists. From 2019 to May 23, during the last 20 years, about 163 journalists have been killed, assassinated in Mexico. Thousands more have been threatened. It is a very bad situation in which one has to differentiate the capital city in which I live, where we have more protection, physical protection. The real danger is in the countryside. Therefore, I conduct a research group at the Colegio de Mexico, which is one of the top research institutes, and I coordinate a seminar, a program to study violence and peace. And in that regard, we have created a group of consortium of organizations to try to understand violence. Why journalists, environmentalists, human rights defenders, candidates for local office, why so many of them are killed? We conduct a study about the assassination of 32 candidates in a local election, and we have been commenting with other organizations that defend journalists and environmentalists, and we have detected a few patterns that I think are relevant to understand violence all over the world, actually. One, most of them, 30 out of the 32, were assassinated in the style of organized crime. If you want, I can go into details about what that means, but basically is that they are executed in public spaces. It is by a group of hitmen or an individual hitman that kills you in the spot. Second, that when we studied those 32 cases, only 11 were actually assassinated by organized crime. All the others were, the executions were ordered by local politicians, by entrepreneurs, mining industry, for example, has used assassination to kill environmentalists. Most of them, journalists, environmentalists, human rights defenders, are social leaders as well as journalists. And that's very important because it is not that they are killing just journalists. What they want to eliminate is people that are regarding the consciousness and at the same time the guiding force for an organized action against for the dispute of power sharing at the local level. So what are we going to do? We are starting the patterns of violence. We are going deeper and making comparisons. I'm not going to the methodology of violence against civic leaders and that are happen to be journalists sometimes. But what we want to elaborate is a methodology to anticipate violence. I mean, how do you detect in the social web, for example, signs that somebody is in danger of threats or assassination? And that's and once we reach that level, and I hope we will start. Actually, we will start next year because we are going to have a huge election of president and 20,000 other offices all over the country. So we want to experiment with the methodology because, I mean, I think it's very useful to denounce and to give examples, concrete examples of the implications. For example, I have paid $20,000 of my own money, and I have had the protection of lawyers that don't charge me money, the protection of Article 19, the England-based organization that is doing an excellent work in Mexico, the United Nations, the OAS, the Organization of American States. That is, I am a privileged journalist and a scholar that is being protected by organizations, but it is not enough. People at the local level are the ones that are in most in serious threat, and we in a serious danger. And it is not enough to denounce. We have to anticipate and prevent violence. So that's
Sergio, that's really interesting. Thank you. I'm just conscious we
yes.
have quite a lot of panelists, so if it's okay, I'd love to come back to you once we can finish. Wonderful. We'll go on to our other panelists to give their opening remarks. Dan, I'm going to turn to you next because I would argue you have single-handedly had quite a large impact on the Conservative Party. You, of course, I mean, many people in this room will know a lot about your case, but you had a legal threat from Nadhim Zahawi, at the time the Conservative Party chairman, and it resulted in a huge amount of change. He was obviously, of course, forced to resign. And Sacked, there we go. We'd like to hear a bit more about how that was, taking on a sitting politician here in the UK.
Maybe the first thing to say that struck me when I saw this panel was that I feel like a bit of a fraud. So, I mean, the idea that a journalist could suffer criminal prosecution, has to hire bodyguards, is afraid of assassination, beyond terrifying. That instinct that I felt a fraud is actually just a form of complacency, that everything in the UK is so shiny and golden and it's nothing like that here. And it is nothing like that here, but we still have a serious problem with SLAPP, and it is a threat. I don't want to sound too pompous and dramatic, as lawyers easily can, but I think it is a threat to the rule of law, because it means that people, bad actors, have the ability to stand outside the legal system and assert what they want and get their way by dint of the power of money, rather than the power of law or democracy or highfalutin notions like journalism and truth. That's my long-winded justification for why I think it matters, even though I was never in the slightest danger of being arrested or shot.
It's not a criteria to be on the panel, though.
Excellent. So, I'm a tax lawyer. I've retired from 25 years or so as a tax lawyer in May 2022, and I started a small think tank, Tax Policy Associates, and I'll be writing about tax policy. And I had 8,000 followers on Twitter, and I was very happy with the influence I had with a sort of few policymakers, tax nerds, assorted legal people. I was asked to look at a couple of Tory politicians who'd been accused of tax avoidance. One of them was Sunak, one was Jeremy Hunt. The accusations were nonsense. They were, I thought they were being treated rather unfairly by the media in a couple of cases. Then there was a story in the Independent which said that Nadhim Zahawi, who'd just been made Chancellor of the Exchequer, was being investigated by HMRC and the National Criminal Agency. And he denied it, but if I was investigated by HMRC or the NCA, I wouldn't know about it. So his denial was meaningless. Most of the time, it's very hard to look into the tax affairs of someone. If I was avoiding tax, you would have essentially no way to discover it. HMRC's workings are, rightly, I think, confidential. But Zahawi's tax avoidance had concerned a company that was listed years later. And when a company is listed, lawyers and accountants crawl all over it and write reports saying exactly what had happened, little mistakes it got wrong, how they were fixed, etc., etc. That meant there was a mine of information. And going through that, it became clear to me very quickly that he'd done something really weird, which could only be explained by tax avoidance. In a sense, I'm a one-man band. In a sense, I'm not, because I have lots of friends, contacts, former clients, former colleagues, with expertise in all kinds of legal and tax fields. And so I showed this to them, and everyone thought that it stank. So I wrote about it, and I said that it looked like Zahawi had avoided tax. His response was to brief the press an explanation which seemed completely wrong, and I said that I thought he was lying. At which point it was a summer's afternoon. I was sitting by a lake, my children splashing around and having fun, and my 10-year-old was climbing a ladder out of the water, slipped, caught his leg. We thought he'd broken it, was screaming in pain, and girls had to go and pull him out of the water, and a friend helped him out of the water, and my wife was really anxious. And I was standing there ignoring all of this, staring at my phone, because I just had a direct message from a lawyer acting for Nadeem Zahawi, threatening me with defamation proceedings. The thought that could happen had never crossed my mind. I got an email from them which ordered me to retract, and the email said that it was confidential and couldn't be published. Now, I'm an experienced lawyer. I'm not an expert in the law of confidence, but I know enough to be dangerous. So that seemed like a false claim to me. It didn't just say it was confidential. It said there would be serious consequences for me if I published this. So I have a Rolodex full of lawyers. I called lawyers who are experts in the law of confidence. And they said, this is nonsense. Who makes claims like this? Of course it's not confidential. We've never seen that sort of thing before. They weren't libel lawyers. I then spoke to some libel lawyers, and that happens all the time. It was absolutely standard practice, you'll know this bit better than me, for these law firms sending out their libel threats to assert that their letters are confidential and can't be published. And that's a lie. So we talk about bad actors. Zahawi was a terrible actor because he was bluffing. He could never have taken this to court because he was lying, and he would have been rapidly undone. And that became clear quite quickly. So not only was I not in danger of being shot, I was never in any real legal jeopardy. I was in quite a rare, comfortable position. And that let me make something of an attack on this behaviour of libel lawyers. I wrote to the Solicitors Regulation Authority and said, surely lawyers cannot lie and say their libel threats are confidential when they're not. And it didn't have much effect on me, but when they write to laymen, it absolutely does have an effect. And in fact, I spoke to a number of journalists and in-house lawyers at newspapers who were not as able to just disregard those threats as I was, because they have managers, editors, shareholders. They can't take the risk that it's wrong in a way that I could. So this lie that you can't publish slaps had real consequences. And to their credit, the SRA acted with remarkable speed, and in I think about 6 weeks, put out a warning notice saying that this was bad and wrong and you couldn't do it. But people are still doing it. I had one myself, this time arguing that what they'd sent me was copyrighted and couldn't be published. I published it. And I was sent just last week by a journalist a letter they'd received from a major media law firm threatening them with libel proceedings and saying this letter's confidential and can't be published. People are still doing it. So the challenge for the Solicitors Regulation Authority is, what are you going to do about it? So if you have a rule and you don't enforce it, you may as well not have a rule. The other challenge is, what are you going to do about the years and years of law firms sending these threats to people and completely silencing them? Because I spoke to more than a dozen people, bloggers, tweeters, writers at small local newspapers who'd received letters like this, believed that they couldn't publish them, and so just shut up, and they were silenced. And that's profoundly wrong. And I hope that there are consequences for those that wrote those letters, no matter how many years ago it was. At this point, I'm not confident there will be, but it's something that I want to return to.
Jan, that's brilliant. And obviously, you sort of have the running theme where you also were sued by a politician. We now have two brilliant lawyers on our panel as well. I mean, the leading experts of media law here in the UK, Keelan Gallagher, Pia Sarma. Keelan, I'm going to come to you first, because you can continue with that international perspective. You obviously act for a number of journalists who have faced legal threats from politicians. I mean, Maria Ressa, Daphne Caruana Galizia, just to name a few. I'm sure you have many on your list to discuss today. Acting as a lawyer, what does this mean? How is this impacting media freedom? How is this impacting the way journalists are able to report?
Thanks very much. I should start by saying Dan started his speech by saying he felt like a fraud, and he then gave us a masterclass in how to be a hero of media freedom. So I think Pia and I, as the lawyers, following four people who've done such remarkable things in the name of media freedom, are probably the people who feel like the frauds here. So look, the title of this panel about when the political becomes personal is not a surprise. You know, you have a situation where journalists hold the powerful to account, shine a light on misbehaviour by the powerful, shine a light on issues like the ones Dan has just been talking about. Politics is about the exercise of power. Politicians often have a reliance on continuing good reputation for re-election. So it's not a surprise that the two come into conflict in this way. So in many ways, it's unsurprising that we see politicians using the law to silence their critics. And some of the most effective critics of all are journalists, or indeed tax lawyers on a mission, who've become journalists, kind of citizen journalists. But it's a particular issue for politicians for the reasons that Dame Margaret Hodge was alluding to at the start, because this is not just the same as an oligarch or a businessman or some other powerful actor trying to silence journalists. This has a particularly profound impact in a democracy, particularly a representative democracy, and particularly where politicians are lawmakers, where in fact there may be a conflict of interest or corruption in relation to a lawmaker who's got a vested interest, which journalists want to expose and which impacts on how they make laws. There may be hypocrisy in what they're doing, and there's many examples of that. So look, I wanted to highlight 6 features that I tend to see in these cases which involve politicians trying to shut down journalists. So 6 features, there's many others, but these are just 6 to highlight. First is that I often see attrition. So multiple cases coming after the same journalist or the same media organisation in an attempt to wear them down. I'm conscious that many of you have been here throughout yesterday and today. Some of you will have heard about the case of Caroline Muscat, for example, in Malta. Many of you will know about the case of Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, and you'll have heard from some of her family, indeed, yesterday. And I represent her family, and at the time of her death, she was facing 48 libel suits, 43 civil, 5 criminal, and I'm ashamed to say many of those were entirely unmeritorious libel suits, which originated here in London. So cross-border threats to try to get her to be silenced. But we see that a lot, this kind of attrition. It's like a playground game of whack-a-mole where the person has to deal with multiple different targets. And just one example, for those of you who have not seen the brilliant case, European Slap Contest Politician of the Year, when you look through that every year, you see these examples of people who have huge number of lawsuits where they try to go after multiple journalists, or they target an individual journalist or individual media organisation with a huge number of suits. And it's designed to be attritional and to make them stop doing their job. So just one example, Jaroslaw Kaczynski in Poland. That's an example in Poland from 2021 where there were over 50 lawsuits against an individual newspaper and its journalists at the same time. Now, how do you do your job if you're facing 48 lawsuits at the same time and your accounts being frozen in the way Daphne Caruana Galizia was as a freelancer, or if you're facing 50 different lawsuits as a small local paper in Poland? And the answer is, makes it much harder to do your job. And it's also one of the reasons why they targeted Dan in the way that they did, just essentially to try to drain his time, his resources, and stop him doing what he was doing. But in all 3 of those examples, they picked on the wrong people because it seems to have strengthened their resolve. Second point is that I'm often seeing it being cross-jurisdictional. So, for example, the Azerbaijani laundromat case, some of you will have seen my colleague Jonathan Price, who was here yesterday, or Jennifer Robinson, who's speaking later on at the evening event. And they acted for Paul Radu with a law firm here in London who were acting pro bono and who wanted to stand up and help speak truth to power. But this was an Azerbaijani MP attempting to use the long arm of the law to try to silence OCCRP and Paul Radu through using libel tourism, essentially, here in London. And lawyers had to stand up to them, see the whites of their eyes and see off the threat, which resulted in there being a settlement just before the case was due to go to trial. And I'm afraid on the other side, again, you have unmeritorious claims and London lawyers being participants in that. I want to come again to some examples of cross-jurisdictional issues maybe in the discussion. But third feature is picking up on something that you said, Dan, about the copyright threats, because increasingly I'm seeing that people are not just using cyber libel, criminal defamation, libel cases, they're being much more creative in their use of law. So we're increasingly seeing politicians say, well, this is a breach of intellectual property law, for example. Or something else I'm seeing is allegations that someone is breaching a law, which means that the journalists themselves are suspicious in some way. So my client Maria Ressa in the Philippines being accused, for example, of being in some way fraudulent, and my client Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong being accused of being fraudulent. So journalists being accused of being tax evaders, fraudsters, and so on. And that's much harder to tackle, because many people see that a piece of public interest journalism which is published and where a threat is made using criminal defamation is obviously a violation of international standards. We all know it's a violation of Article 19 of the ICCPR. But when you start throwing mud and saying this journalist is a fraudster, this journalist is a tax evader, it's much harder and people are less sympathetic. Fourth point to make is that increasingly I'm seeing politicians in jurisdictions where there is protection recognising that public figures can be held to account using proxies. So trying to present a front behind a private businessman, for example. They can say this is really a private dispute, but behind it pulling the strings is a politician, and often a government politician. Fifth point is an increasing trend of targeting support networks. That increasingly is happening, particularly where the politicians in question are in government. One very short example, Hong Kong and China are using the long arm of the state to target not only journalists themselves, but also their support networks. And that has involved, for example, someone like Benedict Rogers, who runs Hong Kong Watch, being threatened using the national security law in Hong Kong. He's being threatened and told he's a criminal for material he's putting on his website here in the UK. I and my colleagues acting for Jimmy Lai, as well as having rape threats and death threats and so on for doing our job, have also been accused of breaching criminal laws in Hong Kong and China by filing legal appeals with the United Nations just for doing our job. And that's increasingly a tactic. And really what it's designed to do is to say that the journalist should not only be frightened that if they speak truth to power and stand up that they'll be targeted, but also the NGOs who support them, the lawyers who support them. And it's meant to send a message to us all saying, keep quiet or you'll be next. That's what it's designed to do. And we can't let it happen, which is why the four people that I'm following, what they do is so incredible in the face of such terrible threats. And then the sixth point is picking up on something Dan said. Dan mentioned at the start how different it may feel here in the UK. But in my very firm view, there is a very clear continuum between the kind of examples that Dan is talking about and the kind of examples that Chitima and Sergio are talking about. Sergio was talking about violence against journalists and deaths of journalists. And I act for many bereaved families of journalists. And often what you see is that there was a climate of impunity at the highest level where a journalist is presented as fair game. Now that's something which former President Trump in the US was complicit in, calling journalists enemies of the people. In Malta we saw not only a climate of impunity in Malta at the highest possible levels, as was exposed in the public inquiry, but also Malta not being called out by European neighbours, by Council of Europe and EU neighbours, or similarly Jamal Khashoggi. We see a situation where Agnes Callamard, former UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial killings, stood alone a number of months previously when calling out Saudi Arabia's behaviour, and many other states didn't do it. And may I give one very recent example of that? And I'm just conscious that we're in the UK and I want to call it out. We're in a situation where we, as the lawyers for Jimmy Lai, were named in the Secretary General's reprisals report in September as the only example named in respect of China about being targeted, both us and Sebastian Lai, his son, for standing up for Jimmy Lai's internationally protected rights. And Secretary General in the UN highlighted that and said what was happening was concerning. Now, everyone on our team, apart from me, is a UK national. I'm an Irish national. The US government at the UN General Assembly called out what was happening and supported us. The UK government said nothing. Now, I find that disgraceful. There's 5 people on my team. 4 of them are British nationals. I'm a British resident, have lived here since 2001 for over 20 years. Why is our government, to whom we pay many taxes, Dan, you'll be pleased to hear, why is our government not calling out this behaviour? Why are we finding stronger voices coming from the US and Canada and the European Union than we're finding from the UK itself? And that goes for my client, Jimmy Lai. Why has now the 3rd Foreign Secretary failed to meet Jimmy Lai, a British national, in prison in Hong Kong? You know, why do you have to have Richard Ratcliffe starving himself outside the Foreign Office before a Foreign Secretary will have a meeting? I'm conscious the civil servants here, and when we're talking about what we do, we need to think, when we move on to the solutions in the discussion, about what we can do to protect people like Chittima and Sergio, who are facing such terrible experiences in their own countries. We need to think what moral leadership countries like the UK and European Union, US, Canada, and Media Freedom Coalition partners can do. But we do also need to think about why so little is being done by many of those states who proclaim that they support freedom of expression, but actually when it comes down to it, they are silent. They didn't call out Malta before Daphne's death in 2017. They're not strongly calling out situations like Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong, and they're not even standing up for UK nationals and UK residents who are targeted by states from abroad. I think it's a disgrace, and we should call them out.
Thank you, Keelan. You're brilliant as ever. Pia, I'm going to turn to you for our second legal opinion. I want to take it home a little bit. We're here in London. Our legal offices are all around the corner from here. And you yourself act as the legal director at the Times and the Sunday Times. These are decisions, you know, to call out politicians, to engage with politicians that you're taking every day. You're weighing up these risks, and you have, you know, the backing of a brilliant newsroom behind you. How do you weigh up these risks, and how do you decide when is it time to hold power to account, despite the possibility that legal action might be taken against you and your newspaper?
Picking up, I've got the pleasure and ability to be able to pick up on so many comments made by my members of the panel and speakers here today, which reminds me always, this is not meant to be an exercise in humility, but about the power of journalism and how brilliant the journalists are. And I am extremely lucky to lead a very good team of lawyers in a newsroom which has pushed against issues for many years. Every newspaper in this country has its ups and downs, and the Sunday Times in particular has really tried to hold politicians to account. And I've had many conversations with editors over the years about the First Amendment, the constitutional protections in the US for free speech, and conversations in their room whereby we say, well, why don't we have that? Because it'd be a lot easier to go after X politician if we did have that, if we had those protections, if we were able to publish to a certain extent with impunity about those who are in public offices and who should, in theory, be held to account. And really, we're in a place where, even in London, which is meant to be, you know, it is a democracy, and a beacon for free speech, and it is in comparison to so many countries you face, we are navigating every day treacherous libel laws, which are without a doubt enabling people to suppress public interest information. And I think perhaps until this campaign, even though I've been involved in policy and law change over, you know, more than 15 years now, I think we've become normalised. This is normal. This has been normalised. So it has become part of my job to say, oh, this is a letter which says private and confidential on the top. and to go, in my case, let's ignore that. And by the way, I was once reported to the Solicitors Regulatory Authority for doing exactly that on a piece of public interest
What did they do?
journalism. They dropped it. They didn't take it. But I had to take advice. You know, I'm an employee of a big news organisation that could have compromised me. I went to a KC. I actually went to Heather Rogers, a dearly departed friend from same chambers as Keelan Gallagher, and got her advice on private confidential and what it meant and whether my conduct had been improper or not. But that was clearly a device designed to put pressure on me personally. And I think, you know, the heads of legal departments in big newspapers who are pushing against these stories are targeted personally, not perhaps with death threats, well, certainly not in my case, but constant pressure. And the decisions that we're having to help on, and editors ultimately make a decision, are very difficult, and they require quite a lot of experience and skill, which comes with time. They need support. They need resource. You know, I can phone a KC. How damn lucky am I? Nobody says, how much is that going to cost? If you are a freelance journalist, unless you have special skills like Mr. Neidle here, you're going to pause. You know, he's a lawyer, and I think that gives you, for example, an advantage. If you are, and I don't say a mere journalist, but only a journalist without any legal expertise, it is a minefield to navigate through these issues. We do it. How do we do it? Well, we do it because that's what newspapers are for. And we do it because I was very conscious of the weight of the history of the Sunday Times and Times, the number of cases that they'd fought in the courts and won, and how it had always strived to improve the laws for public interest journalism. And I took that very seriously. And when the Defamation Act came in force in 2013, we did our best to try and contribute to the conversations around public interest journalism, to get a defence up and running, which would help this kind of investigative deep investigations that the Sunday Times has done. And it does help. But I talk to lawyers and other organisations who will often say, well, you know, that public interest defence is just not going to work, and we're not going to be able to defend it, and editor's not going to spend years in court. We haven't had a few libel cases for a few years now, but I've battled with journalists alongside the journalists in court through Section 4, as it's now called, Reynolds defence before defences, and they are really, really difficult. And often enough, a lawyer will say to an editor, well, we can have a defence on the public interest, but I can't guarantee we're going to win. Now, most editors they say, well, what do you mean you can't guarantee we're going to win? How much is it going to cost? £500,000, maybe £1 million? And then we have to pay the other side's costs as well. So if we go down on this, it's going to cost us £2 million for a front page story, which has been distributed to, 1 million people. It's available online, hugely damaging, for example, to a politician. Editor's going to go £2 million. Well, how many junior reporters is that going to take out of our, running? How many foreign reporters won't be able to be sent out into the field because of that? How much less security can we have for those foreign reporters? They've got a whole budget there. The legal budget is only one tiny part of it. So taking that risk damages journalism, potentially damages journalism, the other journalism they're doing in their newsroom. It's a massive risk for them to take, and reputationally for them, for the newspaper. And journalists, and lawyers also worry about making the wrong decision. If I get that call wrong, and I say, go ahead, publish that front page, and it ends up in £2 million in damages for the newspaper. It's untold damage. And even when you think you've got something right, journalists are put through the ringer. We had one case which was brought by a former Tory treasurer of the and he used to basically look at fundraising for the Tory party. And he sued us in libel, Peter Cruddas. And our headline was basically a cash for access headline. So we accused him of enabling access through donations to the Tory party. It is well known that this happens. It wasn't a new revelation to say that if you pay money to the Tory party, you're going to get some access. But what we had reported was Peter Cruddas' comments made through subterfuge. So the journalist had gone in, wired up, a bit like this, but not as visible.
Didn't have a Britney mic.
Yeah, didn't have the diva mic. But they go up with cameras and they work not on a hunch. They have quite a lot of information that this is going on, and they investigate. Now, it is a very controversial form of undercover journalism. And people hate it, naturally, because they think they're talking to somebody they're not they don't realise it's a journalist. It is extremely controversial. I mentioned the First Amendment in America. A lot of American lawyers do not like this. They say that it's bad form, go in the front door. For the Sunday Times, it has been extremely successful, and it has had led to changes in the law. The Guardian also, cash for honours, cash for peerages. There have been any number of undercover investigations which have really, really focused on MPs. And when the journalists go in and we read the transcripts, we're amazed that they're still doing this. We sort of almost go, well, didn't you twig this was a journalist talking to you? Because there have been so many scandals about cash for access, for example, that you would think that they would talk carefully, and they don't. And they often don't when money is on the table. And this is the kind of erosion of democracy that journalism in this country is brilliant, in my view, of calling to account and keeping a watching eye on. We could talk about journalism as a watchdog. It is, and it's often ahead of the law, and it will capture things that the law won't capture. The rules for parliamentarians are notoriously broadly read by the Commissioner for Standards, for example. Some of the reports are, in my view, very broad and sometimes akin to sort of a whitewash, depending on who they're looking at. So who else is going to watch those watchdogs apart from the journalists? But there's no protection of real substance when you go into that process. You are hedging your bets. You're taking a huge risk because there's a lot at stake. These are people who've worked their way up the parliamentary system. They've put themselves out to electorates. They say that they are ready to be held to account, but they've got a lot to lose. And when reputations are at stake, there is a huge amount to lose. So they will fight back. They are perhaps the next Prime Minister. They are the next Chancellor of the Exchequer. They are running for power. It is all about power. It is all about money. So you go up against these people, they are going to push back. The conversations we have in the newsroom are fraught, even when we know we're right. And we're a huge newspaper. So we know we're right. We've got the information. We've got the sources. We've got documents sometimes. We're worried about being injuncted for use of documents which are confidential on the face of them. Because we're worried that even though our assessment of public interest is strong in our minds, a judge may not agree with us, and it's going to cost us an arm and a leg. We're worried about things like the PR machine of Number 10 or the Tory party or the Labour Party going into overtime and briefing to another newspaper. We worry about PR agents and their lawyers, hand in hand, sending out missives trying to spoil the story. They're called spoilers. These are all rotten behind-the-scenes activities that go on when you're trying to get a story out that is going to be hugely damaging.
A lot.
That's all.
Please. To say, for those of you who don't know, Pia and her team at the Times not only do superb work defensively, but also have been responsible through a lot of the proactive work that you've done in exposing very important issues. And I just think for those of you who weren't aware, it's worth saying the work that your team has done is incredible. The same is true of that team at The Guardian under Jill Phillips previously and now under Zoe Norden, but also individuals, people like Louise Tickle, Brian Farmer at the Press Association who've done such brilliant work. And there's one example which is not a slap so much, but is a judgment which is definitely worth looking at in light of some of the issues you've raised. Those of you who haven't seen the Griffiths and Tickle case, this is a case I was in for Rights of Women, the NGO, but this was about a former MP who had been found in the family courts to have raped his wife and to have engaged in sexually violent behaviour, coercive and controlling behaviour. And he tried to use his child essentially as a legal human shield, to say it's all about the best interest of the child, it shouldn't be public. And it was dogged fighting over a long period of time by Brian Farmer without a lawyer and Louise Tickle with a very good legal team, with support from Tortoise, support from The Guardian, support from the Press Association, who uncovered that story. And we're talking here primarily about defensive work, but actually the work that Pia and colleagues do proactively in uncovering these stories is hugely important. And the first instance judgment of Natalie Leven is a masterclass in precisely why there was such a public interest there and why this wasn't like Naomi Campbell's private life. This was an MP and a former minister who had held himself out as a family man in one way and in fact had committed a very serious criminal offence. So at a time when he was a lawmaker, he had committed sexual violence against his wife. And there was an attempt by him to use the family courts, another example of creative use of the law, to use the family courts to keep that silent. And it was colleagues of Pia's who fought that rightly and won.
Brilliant.
Can I just mention one other thing? The SLAPS campaign is a brilliant one, and it brings to the fore so many issues that, as I say, that we as media lawyers have been dealing with for a long time and haven't tackled ourselves, despite the very generous words Keelan has just spoken. But there is a conversation at the moment about SLAPS isn't as big an issue as everyone thinks. And those who are on the other side of the fence, to me, the claimant lawyers, are very keen on this version of stories. And they are, I think, very much looking at the number of cases that actually progress into courts. And I cannot emphasise enough that this is not just about that, as you probably all would agree. I can see people nodding at me. But I think the focus has been very much on that, and that's why they are able to speak up and say, look, this isn't an issue, because they're just looking at what's going on through the courts, they're looking at judgments. But I think talking to journalists and speaking to everyone and this continuum that Keelan talks about, I hate to use this kind of expression, but what do they say? The thin end of the wedge, because no, we don't have violence against journalists in the same way as there are in other countries. But there is a creeping problem here, and it's not just a small problem. And it's not evidenced just by what you see in the courts. It is about the conduct of lawyers. It's about the multiplicity of actions brought under a number of laws in a number of countries, and it's about this failing to understand that there is something called public interest journalism. Now, no one would say that claimants can't protect their clients from stories which are fundamentally untrue. They say there are not many SLAPs. I say there are not many of those kind of stories where you're actually trying to publish something which is entirely untrue.
But the not many SLAPs thing is ridiculous. I don't think anyone in the history of human civilization has admitted to issuing a SLAP. Everyone denies it's a SLAP. The more they deny it's a SLAP, the more likely it is to be a SLAP. And a core feature of SLAPs is they don't really want to go to court. Going to court will make it public, the thing they're trying to avoid. They want to achieve a withdrawal, maybe a settlement. They tend not to care about that. They want a withdrawal, and they want it outside the public spotlight. So to look at the cases getting to court is to completely misunderstand the nature of SLAP, and in the case of the claimant lawyers, deliberate deception about the nature of SLAP. You probably can't say that, I can.
I'm conscious that we have a brilliant panel and lots of audience members that will want to ask questions. I do want to just bring in Sergio, if he's still here. Is he still here?
I am here, yes.
Hi, Sergio. I wanted just to come into you and to Chittima as well. You both have obviously faced horrific legal threats, and many of them haven't happened in a vacuum. They've resulted in actually a huge amount of physical threats against you as well. And we are conscious that we don't have a ton of time, but I was wondering if you could speak to that very briefly. I mean, you talked about having a bodyguard in your home. How does that impact your work as a journalist?
Oh,
I think that's the right reaction.
you have to normalize violence. You have to learn how to live that and without letting interfere with your work. It is, I mean, psychoanalysis helps, of course, but it's also a question of discussing a lot with your family, because at the end you are alone with your family facing these threats. I mean, and then you have to learn how to deal with the bodyguards. I have had, they are military officers. So I have had them for 6 years now. They are basically the same. One of them died of COVID. You learn how to deal with them at the human level. And you learn a lot about how they are trained, how they are prepared, what you should do in case problem. I mean, it's something, again, I usually don't talk because it's very complicated. It has many levels. And when a colleague, a journalist, or a human rights defenders ask me, what can you advise me? What I said, normalize as much as possible your situation. Be happy that you are alive so far. Don't think too much about the future, but defend your, believe that you have the right to defend your dignity and to defend and not to continue expressing your ideas. Now,
Thank you, Sergio.
You also learn to reduce risks in your writings. I mean, it takes a lot of training, internal training in this kind of. I must say, in my lifetime, I have had bodyguards for about 15 years. In two previous periods, when I was just a human rights defender, I had problems, but I don't want to put it as an act of heroism, but as part of the consequences of living in a very difficult world, and one has to learn not to be bitter about that, but to understand that that's part of the rules of the game. And as my psychoanalyst told me, did anybody ask you to be a bullfighter? I said, no. Well, you must learn to take the applause and the consequences, the bad consequences. And that, I think that I have been able to do it. I live in peace, not quiet. You have to be in alert, permanent alert, but you have to handle that. It's part of life.
Well, thank you so much, Sergio, for sharing that. We're going to open the floor to some questions. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I'm sure there are many questions. So we do have a roving mic. Does anyone want to ask anything to our brilliant panel? Got one question there. And then we've got one in the stripe just here.
It's a question for Pia. Do you think this campaign in itself has had any effect in moderating claimant lawyers' behaviours? When you're looking at the pre-publication letters coming in or the threats after publication, are they moderating their tone or their behaviour, or are you seeing fewer of those threats, or has it made no difference whatsoever to those those guys?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I keep sort of looking at the stuff we getting through and thinking, God, has this changed? The private and confidential, bizarrely, is still there. Even with, big newspapers where they know that we're watching, it's still there.
Do you send them to the SRA?
Well, the SRA keeps on asking me the same thing. The SRA is very keen for us to keep sending stuff through. The short answer is actually no, we're not at the moment. Again, it's already, we're just sort of saying, well, that it doesn't matter now because everyone sort of realised that it's not an issue. But I can say here, it's still happening. Yeah. I think the tone perhaps has improved. And I've also eavesdropped on quite a few conversations or been invited to partake in conversations with our opposite numbers, and they're very wary about it. Your opposition in in the Zahawi case is not, won't let it lie. They believe, I think, that they were fair, but it is taken to heart. This campaign is having an effect in terms of their examining their conduct. I think, and I'm talking very generally here, I say, but. They think they're right. They think they've got the proper entitlement to defend their claimants if they're being libelled. They would never accept that they've ever been anything other than fair, and I'm not saying that in some cases they aren't, but I think they have moderated their tone, but it doesn't reach every law firm. There are some law firms which are still, going for it. And in some senses, I've been asked this before, some of the smaller law firms, it's almost like the message hasn't quite got through to them that this is an issue, or maybe it's not. While we're talking here, are we talking in a bubble, question mark? Is the message getting out far enough? And I think in this country, there isn't enough said about journalism and about journalism as part of democracy. It all sounds a bit grand when you do that. And then you get, tabloid newspapers and everyone's going, God, you're just defending tabloid newspapers. You work for Rupert Murdoch. You just, it's just all about that. And it gets very politicized in that way. But you're throwing the big issues out with that if you do that, because there may be problems in all of that, but you still need to talk about journalism and its purpose. And I don't think that conversation has had enough, and that's why there are law firms perhaps where they haven't got the message.
We've got another question here in the stripe. Maybe we'll take two in one go, and we've got another question there as well.
There's another one for Pia, actually. It was just, I don't know if you can say anything more about any close calls you've had where you've gone ahead to publish.
And then just another question here.
Hi, my name is John Heathershaw from the University of Exeter. My question is about what can be done about these letters in terms of demonstrating the extent of the problem. So at the moment, the strategy that many of us seem to be using, I've been using it, is to send letters to the SRA and report to the SRA, but it seems like an alternative would be just to publish them. 20 years ago, people were claiming there's not a problem with the offshore system. Obviously, you've used that, Neidle, and just shouldn't we be doing that on a much larger scale with all of us who've received these letters, just putting it in a single repository where they're all there, and you can just send a URL to the next lawyer, the claimant's lawyer, that says this isn't a problem, and the data's there. It just seems to me there's two options there. One is waiting on the SRA and maybe asking them to, put out the aggregate data. And the other is to just go public directly in the way that has been done with offshore data dumps, for example.
Did you want to take the first question?
The first question, close calls.
Close calls.
Close calls. There are often close calls. It's hair-raising when we go to press, especially with the big stories on the Sunday Times. But what often happens is you get weeks, if not months, of correspondence. You get complaints that are sent to IPSO, which enforces the editor's code, which are baseless. There was one that we had against the Times that went on for 18 months, correspondence going to and fro, about an undercover investigation into misogyny and the general treatment of women at Davos. And we'd had reporters go into various social events where they said that they had encountered the use of prostitutes, widely, and we'd reported it. They'd reported whatever they'd seen. And there's no reason why they would have made that up. And one organisation which was behind a Russian event which was affiliated with the Russian state, and in fact had tried to sue us for libel, and we'd thrown it out on the basis that the state couldn't bring a case, but they went to IPSO, and IPSO took 18 months to resolve that. So close calls often, but then there's the fallout from the story, takes months, and don't forget that even a threatened case ties an organisation up in knots, and therefore wards people off. So you have a close call, you have complaints that come after publication, you fight those complaints, and in the meantime, everyone's going, we better not write about that again.
Keelan, did you have an answer to the second question?
You wanted to say something on the second one, didn't you?
Dan?
Yes, so for me the question is, what is the SRA going to do? What are they going to do about the lawyer? First of all the lawyers who wrote letters that falsely claimed to be confidential and couldn't be published before the warning notice, they shouldn't get away with it. What are they going to do with someone who writes that letter today? And if the answer is nothing, then they're wasting their time.
I think your suggestion is quite interesting. If there is a bank, a sort of a reservoir of this kind of letter, I think it's very, yeah.
And bottom line is, sunlight's often the best disinfectant here, because it's a tactic which is used to try to silence. And there's also, I think, with your idea, also has some benefits, I think, for the smaller player who maybe would be in some difficulty. So I think it's really interesting.
There's a particularly awful trend we haven't mentioned of people accused of serious crimes, particularly rape, using libel laws against their victims. And often, picking up on Pia's point, the law firms act with them, maybe even universally. They're not the big law firms one normally hears of. They're small law firms operating under way worse standards than the likes of Schilling's. And that's, I think, beyond disturbing.
And
I'm afraid we are out of time.
And there's an event tonight about that with Helena chairing.
Oh, fantastic.
And the good news
Nina
is
and people
we're about to
speaking.
go to lunch, so if anyone wants to ask any further questions, it can be done over a lovely chicken wrap upstairs. But please join me in thanking our brilliant panellists and Sergio online as well.